The neighborhood wanted him gone. They saw filth, danger, a vagrant disrupting their perfect suburban peace beneath the concrete overpass on Maple Street. They whispered behind curtains, filed complaints with the city, crossed to the other side when walking past his makeshift shelter. But the photograph, tucked deep in his worn jacket pocket, told a completely different story. A story of a hero who once risked everything for his country, now forgotten by the very people he had sworn to protect. Thomas Mitchell had been living under the Richmond Bridge for 8 months now. The concrete structure provided shelter from rain, and the steady hum of traffic above masked the sounds of a man trying to rebuild his shattered life. His possessions were few, but organized with military precision. A sleeping bag rolled tight, a small camping stove, 3 plastic containers stacked with geometric accuracy, and a backpack that never left his side. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. The residents of Riverside Gardens subdivision saw only chaos and decay. But Thomas maintained order in the only space he could call his own. Morning routines began before dawn. While the neighborhood slept comfortably in climate-controlled homes, Thomas would rise at 0500 hours sharp. His internal clock hadn't forgotten 23 years of military discipline. Even if everything else seemed to crumble around him, he would fold his sleeping gear with hospital corners, inventory his supplies, and perform a perimeter check that the casual observer might mistake for aimless wandering. Every movement carried purpose, every glance assessed potential threats or opportunities. The man who once briefed colonels now briefed himself on weather patterns and police patrol schedules. The complaint started 3 weeks after his arrival. Mrs. Henderson from 1247 Elm Avenue initiated the campaign, rallying neighbors with concerns about property values and safety. Phone calls flooded the city council offices. Petitions circulated through manicured driveways and coffee shop meetings. The homeless man represented everything suburban comfort feared: unpredictability, vulnerability, and the uncomfortable reminder that prosperity could vanish without warning. They demanded action, removal, relocation to somewhere far from their children's bike paths and morning jog routes. Children, however, possessed curiosity that adult prejudice had not yet poisoned. 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez noticed him first during her walk to Riverside Elementary. While her mother hurried past with averted eyes, Emma observed details adults chose to ignore. The way he sat perfectly straight despite having no chair, how his clothes were patched but clean, the precise manner in which he arranged stones around his small fire pit. She began dropping quarters from her lunch money near his sleeping area, not from pity, but from an inexplicable sense that this man deserved better than invisible status. Thomas noticed every coin, every curious glance, every whispered conversation about his presence. His senses remained sharp, honed by years of survival in environments where inattention meant death. He recognized the difference between genuine concern and performative outrage, between children's innocent fascination and adults' manufactured fear. The neighborhood's campaign against him followed predictable patterns. First came the complaints, then the pressure on authorities. Finally, the attempts at intimidation that cowards believed would drive him away without direct confrontation. But Thomas Mitchell possessed something his detractors couldn't comprehend: patience forged in desert compounds and jungle clearings where hasty decisions cost lives. He understood waiting, watching, enduring temporary discomfort for long-term objectives. The bridge provided strategic advantages they couldn't appreciate: multiple escape routes, clear sight lines in 3 directions, proximity to resources without excessive exposure. From their perspective, he was trapped beneath tons of concrete and steel. From his, he occupied high ground in a different kind of battlefield. The photograph emerged during quiet moments when traffic noise provided white noise security. Creased from years of handling, protected by a plastic sleeve that had seen better decades, it showed 12 men in desert camouflage standing before an American flag. Thomas appeared third from the left, younger, broader through the shoulders, eyes bright with purpose that hadn't yet encountered bureaucratic betrayal. and systemic abandonment. The insignia on his uniform told stories the neighbors would never believe. Special Forces Qualification Badge, Combat Infantryman Badge, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart. Hardware earned in places whose names remained classified, during operations that official records claimed never happened. His downward spiral began 18 months after returning stateside. Post-traumatic stress triggered by bureaucratic incompetence when the Veterans Administration lost his files for the third consecutive time. Medical appointments canceled without notification. Disability claims denied over technicalities that seemed designed to exhaust rather than assist. Housing vouchers disappeared into administrative black holes, while caseworkers changed positions faster than Thomas could rebuild his paper trail. The system that promised support instead provided obstacles, transforming a decorated soldier into a statistical casualty of institutional indifference. The final blow came when his apartment lease expired during a particularly severe episode. Landlords discovered military disability among rental applications and suddenly found reasons to select other tenants. Employers noticed gaps in employment history and gaps in explanation, choosing candidates whose service records didn't require additional accommodation or understanding. Friends from civilian life gradually distanced themselves from someone whose struggles reminded them of their own vulnerability. Family members offered sympathy but drew boundaries when sympathy required sacrifice or sustained effort. Thomas found himself caught between worlds, too damaged for civilian comfort, too proud for charity dependence, too honest for the manipulations required to navigate systems designed by people who had never experienced genuine hardship. The bridge became sanctuary, not because he chose homelessness, but because homelessness chose him through a series of circumstances that individual determination couldn't overcome. He adapted to his environment the way Special Forces training had taught him. Assess resources, minimize vulnerabilities, maintain operational security, survive until conditions improved. The neighbors intensified their pressure when initial complaints produced insufficient results. Vigilante groups began safety patrols that deliberately passed his location multiple times each evening. Anonymous tips to police claimed suspicious activity, drug use, public intoxication that officers quickly determined were fabricated. Social media groups shared his photograph with warnings about dangerous individuals threatening community safety. The irony was lost on people whose freedom to spread misinformation had been protected by individuals like the man they now sought to criminalize. But Thomas Mitchell was not the broken vagrant they imagined. Beneath layers of accumulated struggle and systematic failure remained the core of a man who had volunteered to serve something larger than personal comfort. His training remained intact, his situational awareness sharp, his protective instincts activated by circumstances beyond his control. The photograph in his pocket served as more than memory. It was evidence of capacity that adversity had not destroyed. And soon, the same neighborhood that demanded his removal would discover exactly who they had been trying to discard. The emergency began on a Tuesday afternoon when 9-year-old Marcus Chen's soccer ball rolled down the embankment toward the storm drain opening beneath Richmond Bridge. What started as a simple retrieval mission quickly transformed into a nightmare that would expose both the neighborhood's true character and Thomas Mitchell's carefully hidden identity. Marcus scrambled down the concrete slope, his sneakers slipping on loose gravel and discarded fast food containers. The ball had wedged itself against a metal grate covering the drainage tunnel, just beyond reach of a child's arms. His friends called from above, their voices echoing off bridge supports and growing increasingly urgent as afternoon shadows lengthened. The boy stretched further into the opening, unaware that recent rainfall had weakened the grate's ancient mounting bolts. Thomas observed the developing situation from his position 50 yards downstream. His trained eye immediately assessed multiple risk factors: unstable footing, compromised infrastructure, inadequate adult supervision, and weather conditions that could turn dangerous within minutes. Dark clouds gathered overhead, promising the kind of sudden downpour that transformed suburban storm drains into deadly torrents. The children above remained oblivious to meteorological warnings, that Thomas read like tactical briefings. The grate gave way with a metallic screech that carried across the concrete channel. Marcus disappeared into darkness with a terrified cry that cut through traffic noise and suburban complacency. His friends screamed for help, their young voices lost amid the urban soundtrack of honking horns and construction equipment. Adults remained safely distant in air-conditioned vehicles and climate-controlled buildings, insulated from crisis by technology and social conditioning that discouraged personal involvement. Thomas moved before conscious decision overrode instinctive response. 23 years of military training compressed into muscle memory that bypassed hesitation and self-doubt. He dropped his backpack, stripped off his jacket to reduce drag, and entered the storm drain without regard for personal safety or social consequences. The tunnel stretched ahead into blackness that emergency responders would need equipment and backup to navigate safely. The drainage system beneath Riverside Gardens represented engineering from a bygone era, when construction prioritized functionality over safety regulations. Concrete passages branched in multiple directions, creating a subterranean maze that trapped sound and disoriented sense of direction. Thomas navigated by touch and instinct, his fingers reading wall textures like topographical maps, while his ears filtered ambient noise for human sounds. Marcus had fallen approximately 40 feet through connecting passages before landing on a debris pile that cushioned impact but created new dangers. Twisted metal, broken glass, and accumulated sediment formed an unstable platform above rushing water from underground springs. The boy remained conscious but frightened, calling for help in a voice that barely carried through concrete channels designed to muffle sound rather than transmit it. Thomas reached the child within minutes that felt like hours to observers gathering above ground. He performed rapid assessment protocols learned in field hospitals and forward operating bases, check for obvious injuries, evaluate environmental threats, establish communication with the victim, prepare for extraction under adverse conditions. Marcus showed signs of shock and minor abrasions, but remained mobile enough for assisted evacuation. The extraction required techniques that civilian first responders rarely employed. Thomas created an improvised harness from his belt and shirt, secured the boy against his chest, and began the climb back through passages that offered minimal handholds and maximum opportunity for catastrophic falls. Each movement required calculation of weight distribution, structural integrity, and backup plans should primary routes become impassable. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance as first responders mobilized resources for rescue operations they assumed would require specialized equipment and trained personnel. Fire trucks positioned themselves along the access road, while paramedics established triage areas for multiple casualty scenarios. News vans arrived with reporters seeking dramatic footage and human interest angles that would capture audience attention during evening broadcasts. Thomas emerged from the storm drain, carrying Marcus with the same calm precision that marked every aspect of his military bearing. He passed the child to his mother, who had arrived at the scene in a state of panic that dissolved into relief and overwhelming gratitude. The boy suffered minor cuts and severe fright, but would recover completely from his underground adventure. The crowd that gathered represented the same neighborhood residents who had spent months campaigning for Thomas's removal. They witnessed capabilities that contradicted every assumption they had made about the homeless man living beneath their bridge. His movements displayed training and confidence that amateur Good Samaritans rarely possessed. His assessment of the situation and immediate response suggested experience with crisis management that went far beyond civilian preparedness. Mrs. Henderson, who had organized petition drives and phone campaigns against Thomas's presence, found herself face to face with a man who had just risked his life to save a child from her own community. The cognitive dissonance created uncomfortable questions about judgment, prejudice, and the stories people tell themselves to justify treating others as disposable problems rather than human beings with unknown histories. Detective Sarah Williams arrived as part of the emergency response team and immediately recognized something familiar in Thomas's bearing and methodology. Her father had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and she understood the difference between civilian heroics and military precision. Thomas's actions followed protocols that suggested advanced training in search and rescue operations, possibly at levels that required security clearances and specialized qualifications. The questions began innocently enough. How did he navigate the drainage system so quickly? Where did he learn rescue techniques? What was his background in emergency response? Thomas answered with the same measured economy of words that had characterized his neighborhood interactions. Minimal information, maximum courtesy, deflection rather than deception. But Detective Williams pressed gently, recognizing signs that other observers missed. The way Thomas automatically checked sightlines and exit routes, his unconscious positioning that maintained tactical advantage while appearing casual, the calm assessment of crowd dynamics and potential threats that came from years of operating in hostile environments where survival depended on constant vigilance. The photograph finally emerged when Thomas reached for his jacket, and the protective sleeve fell from his pocket onto wet concrete. Detective Williams retrieved it before water damage could destroy what she immediately recognized as military documentation from an era when Special Forces operations remained classified long after other conflicts became public knowledge. 12 faces stared up from the faded print. Young men in desert camouflage, with eyes that had seen things civilian populations preferred to forget. Thomas appeared among them, but the insignia and unit identifications told a story that few people possess clearance to fully understand. Combat decorations, special operations qualifications, deployment records from places that didn't officially exist during conflicts that never happened according to public records. The crowd fell silent as Detective Williams studied the photograph with professional recognition. Her training taught her to identify authentic military documentation, and everything about Thomas's record indicated service at levels that required extraordinary sacrifice and uncompromising dedication. The man they had tried to discard as worthless had volunteered for assignments that most people lacked courage to imagine, much less endure. Marcus Chen's rescue became the catalyst that transformed neighborhood perception, but transformation required more than single dramatic events. The photograph represented evidence of service that demanded explanation, context, and ultimately, the kind of recognition that a grateful nation promises, but doesn't always deliver to those who serve in shadows and silence. Detective Williams spent 3 hours researching the photograph's details through military databases that required special clearance to access. What she discovered transformed her understanding of the man living beneath Richmond Bridge from vagrant to veteran of conflicts that most Americans never knew their country had fought. The unit designation led to files marked with classification levels that hadn't been declassified despite decades passing since the operations concluded. Staff Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, 5th Special Forces Group, had served in operations spanning 4 different theaters of conflict. His record included deployments to locations that appeared on no official maps, participating in missions that generated no public recognition or media coverage. The Bronze Star citation mentioned actions during hostage rescue operations in an unnamed Middle Eastern country. The Purple Heart documented wounds received while extracting civilians from a compound under siege by forces that official reports claimed didn't exist. The most revealing document was a commendation letter from a colonel whose name had been redacted, but whose signature authenticated the extraordinary nature of Thomas's service. The letter described actions during a 72-hour operation, where Thomas's team rescued 43 civilians from a terrorist camp, despite being outnumbered 4-1. He had personally carried 6 wounded children to safety, returning repeatedly into hostile fire to ensure no one was left behind. But military service records also revealed the circumstances that led to Thomas's current situation. His discharge papers indicated medical retirement due to traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder, resulting from improvised explosive device attacks during his final deployment. The Veterans Administration had initially approved full disability benefits, then reduced them following budget cuts that affected thousands of veterans simultaneously. Appeal processes had stretched across multiple years, while Thomas struggled to maintain housing and employment. Detective Williams recognized patterns that affected countless veterans returning from undeclared conflicts, where their sacrifices remained invisible to civilian populations. Thomas had served in wars that presidents denied fighting, performing missions that Congress never authorized, protecting American interests through actions that diplomats publicly disavowed. His silence about service wasn't shame or secrecy, but professional discretion that continued even after the government that trained him had failed to provide promised support. The neighborhood's transformation began slowly as word spread about Thomas's rescue of Marcus Chen and the subsequent discovery of his military record. Mrs. Henderson, who had led the campaign to have him removed, now faced the uncomfortable reality that she had tried to criminalize a decorated war hero. Her petition signatures represented residents who had demanded removal of someone who had risked his life repeatedly for people he didn't know, in places they couldn't pronounce, during conflicts they preferred to ignore. Emma Rodriguez continued her daily walks past Thomas's shelter, but now her mother accompanied her, instead of hurrying past with averted eyes. The family had discussed Marcus's rescue and what it meant to have misjudged someone so completely. Emma's quarters continued appearing near Thomas's camping area, but now they came with handwritten notes thanking him for his service and apologizing for the neighborhood's previous behavior. Thomas accepted the changing attitudes with the same measured calm that characterized everything else about his demeanor. He understood crowd psychology and knew that public opinion could shift as quickly in negative directions as positive ones. His military training had taught him to remain alert regardless of apparent friendliness, because today's allies could become tomorrow's threats when circumstances changed or new information emerged. The local veterans organization learned about Thomas through Detective Williams's informal network of contacts within the law enforcement and military communities. Chapter President Robert Hayes, himself a Vietnam veteran, recognized the bureaucratic failures that had transformed a decorated soldier into a homeless statistic. He approached Thomas not with charity, but with offers of assistance navigating systems that seemed designed to exhaust rather than help those seeking earned benefits. Thomas initially declined help with the polite firmness that kept people at safe distances. He had learned not to trust promises from institutions or individuals who offered solutions without understanding problems. Too many social workers, case managers, and volunteer coordinators had disappeared when their good intentions encountered bureaucratic obstacles or personal inconvenience. His independence represented survival strategy rather than stubborn pride. But Robert Hayes possessed credibility that others lacked. His own struggles with Veterans Administration bureaucracy had taught him patience and persistence required to achieve results within systems that rewarded endurance over efficiency. He didn't offer quick fixes or easy answers, but rather committed partnership in long-term processes that might take months or years to complete successfully. The breakthrough came when Hayes presented Thomas with documentation proving that recent legislative changes had restored benefits to veterans whose disability ratings had been inappropriately reduced during previous budget cuts. Thomas qualified for retroactive payments covering the 18 months since his benefits had been eliminated, plus restoration of medical coverage and housing assistance that could end his homelessness within weeks rather than years. Marcus Chen's family invited Thomas to dinner as their way of expressing gratitude that words couldn't adequately convey. The evening provided Thomas with his first indoor meal in months, but more importantly, it offered him contact with civilian normalcy that military life had never prepared him to navigate successfully. The Chen family treated him not as charity case or curiosity, but as honored guest whose presence brought dignity to their home. The dinner conversation revealed aspects of Thomas's character that homelessness had obscured, but not destroyed. His intelligence remained sharp despite months of survival stress. His interest in current events demonstrated continued engagement with world beyond his immediate circumstances. His gentle interaction with Marcus showed natural affinity for children that suggested he would have made an excellent father under different circumstances. Mrs. Chen worked as social services coordinator and recognized symptoms of bureaucratic trauma that affected many veterans who had encountered systematic indifference when seeking assistance. Her professional experience taught her to distinguish between people who had chosen dysfunction and those who had dysfunction imposed upon them through institutional failures. Thomas clearly belonged to the latter category. The neighborhood gradually organized support that went beyond individual gestures to collective action. Property values that residents had worried Thomas would decrease began rising as news media reported on his heroic rescue and military background. Real estate agents discovered that potential buyers viewed communities capable of recognizing and supporting veterans as desirable places to raise families and build long-term investments. Thomas's transition from pariah to respected community member illustrated how quickly social dynamics could transform when people possessed accurate information rather than assumptions based on appearance and circumstances. The man they had tried to discard had volunteered to serve in places most Americans couldn't locate on maps, performing missions that protected freedoms they exercised without consideration of costs others paid to preserve them. But recognition and restored benefits couldn't erase years of trauma or instantly heal wounds that ran deeper than physical scars. Thomas faced a long journey toward rebuilding life that systemic failures had nearly destroyed. The photograph in his pocket would always remind him of brothers who hadn't returned from missions he had survived, carrying survivor guilt that no amount of civilian gratitude could completely resolve. 6 months later, Thomas Mitchell stood in his new apartment, overlooking the same bridge where he had lived in shadow and silence. The Veterans Administration had processed his restored benefits. Robert Hayes had navigated the bureaucracy, and the Riverside Gardens community had collectively funded his security deposit through donations that arrived anonymously in his mailbox. The apartment was modest but clean, furnished with essentials that represented luxury after months of concrete and cardboard. Thomas maintained military precision in his organization, but now he had proper storage for belongings that meant something beyond mere survival. The photograph of his unit held place of honor on a simple wooden shelf, no longer hidden in protective sleeves but displayed where morning light could illuminate faces of brothers who deserved remembrance. Marcus Chen visited weekly, bringing homework questions and soccer updates that gave Thomas connection to community life he had forgotten existed. The boys' genuine friendship provided healing that no medical treatment could replicate. Through Marcus's eyes, Thomas rediscovered purpose that extended beyond military missions to everyday interactions that mattered precisely because they seemed ordinary. The neighborhood transformation extended beyond individual attitudes to systemic changes in how residents viewed homelessness and veteran affairs. Mrs. Henderson organized monthly support meetings for local veterans, transforming her petition-writing energy into advocacy for people she had previously tried to remove. The community established an emergency fund for veterans facing housing crises, ensuring that stories like Thomas's wouldn't repeat in their area. Detective Williams maintained contact with Thomas through professional networks that connected law enforcement with veteran services. Her research into his case had revealed systematic problems affecting thousands of veterans nationwide, leading to policy recommendations that reached congressional staffers and veterans advocacy organizations. Individual rescue had generated awareness that could benefit many others facing similar bureaucratic failures. Emma Rodriguez continued her daily walks past Thomas's former shelter, but now she brought flowers that she placed near the concrete supports where he had maintained dignity during his darkest months. The gesture honored not just Thomas, but all veterans whose service remained invisible until crisis or accident revealed their true identities. Thomas began volunteering at the local Veterans Center, sharing his experience navigating bureaucratic obstacles that defeated people who had survived combat deployments. His quiet competence and authentic understanding provided hope to veterans who had encountered similar systematic indifference. He spoke rarely about his own service, but his presence communicated volumes to men and women who recognized genuine brotherhood. The bridge beneath which Thomas had lived became symbol rather than shame. Community leaders installed a small plaque acknowledging the sight as a reminder that heroes don't always wear uniforms or receive recognition, but they deserve society's support regardless of circumstances that may have left them vulnerable or forgotten. Local media covered Thomas's story as example of community redemption and veteran support, but Thomas avoided interviews and public appearances that would have exploited his experience for entertainment value. His service had been performed in silence, and he preferred recognition that honored principles rather than personalities. The photograph remained his most treasured possession, connecting him to purpose that transcended individual circumstances. Military service had taught him that duty extended beyond personal comfort to collective responsibility for protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. Civilian life offered different opportunities to serve, but the fundamental commitment remained unchanged. As winter approached, Thomas watched from his apartment window as another figure appeared beneath the bridge. This time, the community responded differently. Instead of complaints and petitions, residents organized assistance and outreach. They had learned from Thomas's example that circumstances don't define character, and that people deserve help before judgment. Thomas descended to street level and walked slowly toward the bridge, carrying blankets and hot coffee for someone who needed both warmth and recognition of their basic humanity. The cycle continued, but this time with community support rather than community rejection. The man beneath the bridge looked up as Thomas approached, recognizing something familiar in the bearing of someone who understood survival and service. No words were necessary. Sometimes the most powerful stories don't require explanation. They require continuation through actions that honor the lessons learned. Have you ever encountered someone whose appearance masked their true story? Someone society overlooked until circumstances revealed their extraordinary service or sacrifice. Share their name in the comments below and tell us how they changed your perspective on judging others by their circumstances rather than their character. If this story touched something in you, hit that subscribe button and help us share more stories that honor the invisible heroes walking among us every day. Your support ensures that voices like Thomas's continue reaching people who need reminding that heroism comes in many forms, often wearing the most humble disguises. Drop a comment about which city you're watching from, and let us know if you've ever witnessed a moment when someone's true identity completely transformed how a community saw them. These stories matter because they remind us that the person we might ignore today could be the hero we'll need tomorrow.